Which is the graph of r equals 6 cosine theta? So I say let's make our own little graph and then just see which one it is. And the way we can make a graph is by doing a table of values. Alright, so we'll make a table of values for several values of theta, and then we'll get the corresponding values of r, of course using the equation that they gave us. R is going to equal 6 cosine theta. So let's start with 0. Alright, 0 degrees. If theta is 0 degrees, do we know what cosine is? Well, sure we do. Maybe I can just squeeze this in. I'll squeeze it in right here. Remember the unit circle? So if this is the unit circle, remember that on the unit circle, cosine is always the x value. So at 0 degrees, what's the x value? Well, this is the point 1 comma 0, so the x value is 1. So the cosine here is 1. So what is r going to be? Well, r is 6 times cosine. That's 6 times 1. So this r value will be 6. So let's plot this point. Remember that these are polar coordinates, so this 0 tells us that we're starting off at 0 degrees. And the r tells us that we're going to go out a distance of 6. Okay, so here's a distance of 6, and I'm sitting here at 0 degrees. So my first point should be right there. That alone allows me to choose between these two options. Which one of these two graphs has this point on it? Well, it's this one. Okay, between these two options, only option B includes the point 0, 6. So the answer is going to be B based on that alone. Now, just for your general education, I'm going to plot more points. So we've already answered the question, but just so you can get a better understanding, let's plot some more points and see how the picture develops. Okay, so we did 0. Now, here are some more convenient values that we know for, well, all the trig functions, but including cosine. So remember that we have 30 degrees, 45 degrees, 60 degrees. So let's take a look. So at 30 degrees, pi over 6, cosine is radical 3 over 2. Alright, let's use that. Alright, so my next value is going to be pi over 6, which is 30 degrees. Now my r value is going to be 6 times radical 3 over 2. Alright, so that's going to be 3 radical 3. Alright, so I just took my radical 3 over 2 and I multiplied it by 6 like the formula says. What is the decimal approximation of this? Let's see, 3 radical 3. Alright, so that's 5.2. It's just a little bit more than 5. Okay, so at an angle of 30 degrees, which would be about in here, then my distance should be a little bit less than 6. So, you know, it might be like something like this. Let's go to 45 degrees, which is pi over 4. So that'll be my next number. Okay, so at pi over 4, the cosine is radical 2 over 2. But the r value is 6 times that, so it's going to be 6 times radical 2 over 2. So this is going to be 3 radical 2. Okay, so 3 radical 2 as a decimal, 3 times the square root of 2, that's going to be 4.2. So this is going to be a little bit shorter. So if I go to a 45-degree angle, all right, then my length is getting a little bit shorter. All right, so I started at 6, and then I went to 5, and now I'm at 4. Okay, so as I'm rotating, it seems to be getting, the lengths are getting shorter. All right, so you can probably see that if this were done really precisely, so here at 30 degrees, like this dot right here, 30 degrees might be like right here. And this dot right here, that's at 45 degrees, okay? Like right down the middle, that might be this dot right here. See how it's tracking? Let's see, what's next? So we did 30 degrees, 45 degrees, now let's do 60 degrees. So at 60 degrees, it's pi over 3, cosine is 1/2. All right, let's add that to the chart. Okay, so pi over 3, also known as 60 degrees, the cosine is 1/2, but of course the r value in this case is 6 times that, so 6 times 1/2 is just going to be 3. All right, so again, as I rotate to 60 degrees, all right, which is going to be in this area somewhere, then my value is getting even shorter, maybe like this. So if I did that really precisely, let's say 60 degrees was right in here somewhere, you can see that this dot would be like right there. Okay, let's just do one more. If I went all the way to pi over 2, 90 degrees, okay, if I go to pi over 2, okay, well, we're back on the unit circle again, so now we're talking about this position right here. So at pi over 2, the x value, remember we're doing x values, the x value here is 0. So at pi over 2, the r value, the distance from the center, is going to be 0. So that's where I'm going to get this point from. It would be right here. All right, I'm at an angle of pi over 2, but the distance is 0, which puts me right at the origin. So that would give me this dot right here. All right, so you can see all of these points are landing right on this graph, and they would not match version A. Now, you could stop the video here, but if you're curious about the bottom half of the circle, keep watching. All right, let's start a new chart for the bottom half of the circle, and I'm going to skip to pi because that's the mirror image of 0. So we started at 0, now I'm starting on the opposite side, so that's going to be pi degrees. So I'm trying to line these up so you can see the connection. So at pi, what's the cosine going to be? So remember, pi is right here. cosine is the x value. So the x value is -1. So the cosine is -1. Remember, we're doing, for the r value, it's going to be 6 times the cosine. So that's going to be 6 times -1. So that's going to be -6. Now, what does that mean on this graph? So if I go to an angle of pi, which is over here, the -6 means that I'm going to go 6 in the opposite direction. So here I am at pi, but because it's -6, I need to go -6 in the other direction. So that's actually going to give me this same point that I started off with. It's duplicating that particular point. All right. Now, let's move to this angle right here, the one that is 30 degrees above this side of the x-axis. All right, it's going to be the mirror image of this point right here. So because the reference angle is the same, all right, the reference angle is still pi/6. The cosine is going to be the same. It's going to be, well, the cosine of 30 degrees, remember, was radical 3/2. The cosine here is also going to be radical 3/2. Except for one thing. On the left side of the graph, all the x values are negative. So cosine will be negative in this quadrant. So this time the cosine would be negative radical 3/2. And of course we're multiplying this by 6. Okay, and 2 divides into 6 and makes 3. So whereas before we had 3 radical 3, this time it'll be negative 3 radical 3. Okay, so at this angle, instead of putting a dot over here at 3 radical 3, I need to go 3 radical 3 in the opposite direction. So that's why it's going to put me right here. Now, the name of this angle is actually 5pi/6, but you can just visually see that it's this one right here. Okay, so in a similar way, if I move on to this next one, the one that has a reference angle of pi/4, like 45 degrees, hopefully you can see now that I'm going to get the same value that I did before. So remember we had radical 3/2. 3 radical 2. We're going to get 3 radical 2 again, but because it's the same reference angle. But because we're on the left side, cosine is negative. X values are negative. So I'm going to get all the same values I got the first time, but they will be negative. That's why instead of putting the dot out here, I have to go in the opposite direction. Because it's negative, you go in the opposite direction. That's why it ends up down here. Now, the name of this point is 3pi/4. Alright, the name of this angle is actually 3pi/4. Okay, let's keep going. So if I went to the next position, alright, so this is going to be the mirror image of pi/3. Alright, it's the same, the reference angle is pi/3. So once again, I'm going to wind up getting 3, but because it's on the left, it's going to be -3. So I'm going to wind up going 3 in the opposite direction, which is going to put me right here. Okay, and the name of this this angle is actually 2pi/3. All right, and last but not least, Well, if I went any further, that would just put me back at pi over 2, which we already had. All right, pi over 2 is still going to be 0, which is going to be the same point we already plotted. But that completes the circle.